shyness and all that, but I'm going to press forward anyway. I want to speak to you from a social work perspective as a clinician. And often, many people ask me, well, how did you combine social work and sports social work? How did that happen? And it really started growing up in Chicago with my family, being Bulls fan and the Chicago Bears fan. And growing up, I wasn't an athlete, but I was a huge fan. And I love sports. My family loves sports. And as I progressed in my profession as a social worker, my lens changed in watching sports. I started looking at athletes in a different way. I started looking at some of the issues that the athletes that I love to watch, some of the issues they were having off the court, off the field. And I started wondering, what's going on with that? Why is that? And so I had a passion always in wanting to help people, which drove me to social work and my passion for sports. And it was just naturally, I wanted to combine those things. And that's kind of brought me here today. And really my life's work as far as working with athletes, researching, and wanting to help them. So what's the purpose today? Really, I want to highlight some mental health problems that student athletes can face. And with those issues or health problems, they create vulnerabilities. And vulnerabilities for social workers, that's how we get in the game. That's how we begin to help people when we look at vulnerabilities. And when we think about athletes, we really don't think like that. We think about this physical paralysis, this making all this money, but they're not really vulnerable. But I say, yes, they are. I want to discuss some clinical profiles that I have discovered in working and studying athletes. And by having these discussions, I hope that we can start to reduce that stigma around mental health issues. So who do I hope that we can benefit from this? Athletes themselves, their families, their second families, the coaches in the sport itself, mental health professionals, because I believe that as mental health professionals, we really have to understand this specialized population and how do we treat them, and then society as a whole. So what do we know? What do we know right now? We know that student athletes have unique pressures and stresses placed upon them with their parents, their coaches, their teammates, their fans, and themselves. We know that they have a greater risk of mental health problems than their non-athlete counterparts, less likely to take advantage of mental health services. So I want to have a working definition of mental health. Mental health, a psychological state of someone who is functioning at a satisfactory level of emotional and behavioral adjustment. So what is mental illness? A medical condition that disrupts a person's thinking, feeling, mood, the ability to relate to others, and daily functioning. Mental illnesses are medical conditions that often result in a diminished capacity for coping with the demands of life. And going back to from a social work perspective, what is a vulnerable population? It's identified by race, ethnicity, national origin, color, sex, sexual orientation, gender identity or expression, age, marital status, political beliefs, religion, immigration status, and mental or physical disabilities. Mental or physical disabilities. So how does that relate to athletes? Often, they're coming from impoverished areas. Many are minorities, as we know. We already learned that they're at risk of health problems, which include substance abuse. They're highly influenced by coaches and staff, which creates a closed system. And they're protected a lot of times from rules and consequences. And then our societal views of athletes and mental health, that creates vulnerabilities as well. So some of the risk factors This is just a few. Substance use, as we've already heard, depression, PTSD, chronic traumatic encephalopathy, easily said CTE, body disorders. So we've heard a lot about substance abuse in our first presentation. And for me, without laboring the point, I think the important thing that I want to highlight is that when an athlete abuses alcohol or marijuana, it's different from why they abuse prescription drugs or steroids. And as mental health professionals, we need to understand that because the treatment is different. When someone is taking alcohol or abusing marijuana, they're doing it for the euphoria. When they are abusing a steroid, for an example, they're doing it to have a performance advantage, to recover quicker, to become bigger. And as clinicians, we need to understand that because the treatment is different. Again, this is a specialized population we're talking about. Depression, major depression disorder, which a lot of people suffer from, can begin at any age, but usually the onset is in their 20s. When is that? During college. All that pressure, that stress, now something's happening, I don't understand what's going on, who do I talk to, how do I deal with this? Who's talking about this in these colleges? Anybody? And then situational depression as it relates to athletes. Injuries, loss of position on the team, stress, unable to perform at that peak level, all create situational depression unique to athletes. PTSD. Athletes are experiencing PTSD after brain injuries. We're hearing more and more about it now, more than we have in a long time. The symptoms: avoidance of the event, irritability, reckless or self-destructive behavior, problems with concentration, and sleep disturbance. The average person who experiences PTSD wants to avoid the event. An athlete will avoid that it's happening. Coach, you can put me back in. That hit didn't hurt. I'm okay, coach. It's the avoidance of the effect of what happened to them. And so we have to begin to understand when our athletes are experiencing these things, how are we addressing them? How are we treating them? Or are we just ignoring them? Ray Easterling, Dave Durison, Junior Seau. All NFL players, all committed suicide, all had CTE. Well, we're hearing now in the news more and more about concussions. We're not hearing that much about CTE, though. And as an athlete who starts out at 8 years old playing football, getting those hits, brain injuries, concussions. Then we go into CTE, a person who has a history of multiple concussions and repeated brain trauma. It was first found in boxers, then in American football, ice hockey, European football, soccer, lacrosse, and professional wrestling. The thing about CTE is that we can't find out about it until after the athlete has died. But we do have signs: memory loss, aggression, confusion, depression. And we're hearing a lot now, and actually Easterling's wife is suing the NFL due to what she feels is that they're the cause of that. And so when we know that there are signs, what are we doing? We hear a little bit about the changes of the helmets and that kind of thing, but we as a society really have to begin to think, about football in a different way, and that's scary for folks. There's a lot of money in there. So what do we do? And then body disorders. When we hear about body disorders, a lot of times we think about female athletes with anorexia, but actually there are studies that wrestlers experience that as well. They can weight. Overtraining syndrome with bodybuilders. Overtraining syndrome is I can't get big enough. I can't get chiseled enough. I just keep working out. I keep getting bigger. And then body dysmorphic disorder. It's a new, it made the DSM-5 this year. Kind of a obsession of the body. No real rhyme or reason. It's just I'm very obsessed about my arms or my legs. And we're seeing that in male athletes. So I also believe that with our societal views of mental health really creates barriers. Because when we think about mental health, it's always a negative. It's a sign of weakness. If you're a male athlete, then you're weak, you're not masculine, you're not tough enough, you can't handle it. And when we have those views, that creates barriers for athletes to get the help that they need. And then when we think about athletes, they're a distraction from our lives. The actual sport that they play. They're superhuman. They're overcomers. They're physical excellent. I'll give you an example of a distraction from our lives. If you think back to 9/11, how horrible time that was for the United States. They canceled NFL games. And if you recall, you may not have paid attention to everything that was going on. People, especially in New York and New Jersey, were so angry that the games were canceled. They were so upset that they couldn't watch their football because we needed that distraction. We needed something else to think about. That's how important sports is to us. Not thinking that athletes and coaches and staff are human, they're affected by it too. But it's our perception that this is something that can help us. And so my hope is that we start thinking differently about this. And so through some case studies, in form of interviewing, I've kind of come up with some profiles that I've seen some patterns with athletes. And as Marcus was talking, I was hearing some of those profiles come up, and you follow me with this generational athlete, the escape athlete, the barrier athlete, and the reminiscent athlete. The generational athlete has a grandparent, a parent, and or a sibling, or other family member that played a sport or coached a sport, often the same sport, has a strong family support and involvement, which can be a benefit or a detriment. High expectations are placed on that athlete, often prepared for playing sports. They're already in this sports culture. Well-adjusted is a strength. Early exposure to the sport culture. Some of the risks are pressures, anxiety, and depression. And I want to go back for a second. Why are these profiles that I'm going to highlight, why are they important? Because for mental health professionals, I think we really need to understand why folks go into sports, where they're coming from, because as problems and challenges come up, we need to have a better understanding so we can better treat them. The escape athlete experiences pressures from home and or the community, poverty, violence, crime, gang involvement. Identifies sport can be an avoidance of negative influences. Uses sport to get through difficult times and situations. Finds solace while playing a sport. Moderate sport support at home. Some of the strengths, they're overcomers. Determined and wants that emotional support. Needs that and finds that within the team often. The risk factors. Under pressure can revert to familiar ways of functioning, which can be maladaptive. Abuses substances. Suppresses feelings, has a desire not to deal with painful situations. This is important for us to understand where that individual is coming from so we can know how to treat them. The barrier athlete always plays sports, generally successful, compared to the escape athlete in that uses sports as an avoidance, but the barrier athlete attempts to suppress feelings and emotions out of the psyche. Out of sight, out of mind. Very focused, takes direction well, strong desire to achieve sports goals. Some of the risks, struggles with emotional imbalances. The reminiscent athlete plays sports, was forced to stop for a number of reasons, whether it's injury, age, off the court problems, wasn't good enough to compete, focuses on the past and what ifs, struggles with identity outside of sport, often puts pressure on an offspring playing that sport. The strengths can share experiences and lessons learned. The risk can be aggressive towards offspring playing, poor boundaries, overly ambitious, depression and substance abuse. And you see this a lot with that psycho parent on the sidelines going off, and that reminiscent athlete, and also the generational athlete is this offspring. And I wanted to break this down because, as I said before, I think it's important to really, as coaches coach, as mental health professionals begin to understand this specialized population, that there's a rhyme and reason to this. This isn't just a whole bunch of folks just playing an athletic sport. There's many layers to this, and we need to really understand that. So when we have an athlete who has a mental illness, how do we think about that? When we think athletes are physical, excellent, and they're overcomers, and they're superhuman, and they're distracted from our lives, but then mental illness is negative, and it's a sign of weakness. How do we combine that? But that's often the reality. And as a society, we have to start thinking differently about mental health, student athletes, and athletes as a whole. Some of the methodology that I used was semi-formal interviews with high school players and coaches, college, the list goes on. And it's important to note that there's a big gap. There's a big gap in the research. When we're doing research, there's not a lot out there. But what I hope is that, one, that we understand this population, and two, that mental health professionals really begin to specialize in the needs that these student athletes and athletes as a whole have. So with that, if there are any questions, thank you so much. Oh, okay. That, excuse me, case studies and direct practice. I had 15 to 20. Yes.
I was wondering what you came up with for archetypes, if you read them or if you came up with them, because I need to know who decided. When
They're all mine.
Okay. Thank you. That's all I need to know.
Mine. Yes.
Thank you.
Came to me late at night. Yes.
I'm glad you touched base on the talk about alcohol.
Yes.
Because a lot of athletes, a lot of people that work with athletes, investigate on why you take something.
Yes.
You don't want to be indicated on what we take. Sometimes when you do an investigation, you feel some problems about that person.
And that's, I'm doing some consulting with a high school football team. And what I say is that the substance abuse is almost never about the substance abuse. It's always about something else. And, you know, from my perspective as a social worker, that's what we're looking at. We're looking at all of the things that are involved with that. So absolutely, yes.
I love the strengths and weaknesses profile. Help to really depict the differences in athletes and what problems are there. But in thinking about all the ways that risk factors kind of contribute to how mental illness kind of manifests, what do you see as the greatest barriers for addressing these risk factors and supporting the student athlete mental wellness?
I think the barriers are kind of the perceptions of needing the help. What I have found, though, when I get an athlete in front of me and we begin the work, it's pretty easy, but it's just kind of getting over that hurdle. That's what I have found. But the huge perception of, well, I don't have a problem, or that's not that big of a deal. But what I have found with the adults or with the administrators, it's easier to kind of get in with substance abuse than it is with mental health. It's like this, but it's the same thing. Substance abuse is a mental health problem.
Physical versus not physical.
Right. And so, and that was actually one of the reasons that I decided to go back to and do addictions, because that was one of the ways that I could kind of get in